Alexei Archipovich Leonov stood before the cameras on the 18th of March, 1965, his face still pale from the descent through Earth's atmosphere. He was 30 years old, a decorated Soviet Air Force officer with broad shoulders and steady hands that had just touched the void itself. In the photographs taken that day, his features are sharp and clear. High Slavic cheekbones, dark hair cropped military short, eyes that should have been triumphant but instead held something unreadable, something distant. The official portrait shows him in his white spacesuit, helmet tucked under one arm, smiling at the lens. But if you look closely at that smile, you notice it does not quite reach those eyes. They are looking past the photographer, past the room, past everything familiar, as though searching for something that followed him back from the darkness. The nation erupted in celebration. Moscow's streets filled with crowds waving red banners and shouting his name. Pravda ran the story across its entire front page. The first human being to step outside a spacecraft and survive, floating freely in the vacuum of space, tethered only by a thin umbilical cord to the world of the living. Radio broadcasts proclaimed the triumph of Soviet science, the courage of Soviet man, the inevitable victory of socialism over the cosmos itself. Medals were prepared. Speeches were written. Leonov's face appeared on posters from Leningrad to Vladivostok. He had become, in a single morning, a symbol of everything the Union wanted to believe about itself: invincible, visionary, destined for the stars. But those who stood close to him during the first press conference noticed something the cameras did not capture. His hands would not stop trembling. The conference room at Star City was packed with journalists, party officials, and military brass. Leonov sat at a long table draped in red cloth, flanked by mission engineers and space program administrators. The questions came in rapid succession, predictable and patriotic. How did it feel to float in weightlessness? What did Earth look like from outside the ship? Did you feel fear? Leonov answered each with the precision of a man who had rehearsed every word. His voice was steady, his sentences clear. He described the beauty of the planet below, the silence of space, the honor of serving the motherland. But his hands rested on the table in front of him, fingers splayed wide as though trying to anchor themselves to something solid, and they shook with a fine, continuous tremor that no amount of willpower could suppress. Then came the question that changed everything. A journalist from TASS, a young woman with wire-rimmed glasses and a notebook filled with shorthand, raised her hand and asked, "Comrade Leonov, during your spacewalk, what exactly did you see outside the spacecraft?" It was not an unusual question. It should have prompted another rehearsed answer about the glory of the Soviet achievement, the magnificence of the cosmos, the smallness of man against infinity. But Leonov stopped. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. His eyes shifted to the left, then back to the woman, then down to his trembling hands. The silence stretched across the room like a physical thing, heavy and uncomfortable. 3 full seconds passed. In a press conference, 3 seconds is an eternity. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. And in that pause, everyone present felt it. A wrongness, a hesitation, a crack in the flawless narrative of triumph. When Leonov finally spoke, His answer was perfect. Too perfect. He described the infinite blackness, the curvature of Earth, the sensation of floating untethered in the void. He spoke of pride and duty and the bright future of mankind among the stars. But the pause had already done its damage. The woman with the wire-rimmed glasses wrote something in her notebook and underlined it twice. An official from the Space Ministry leaned over and whispered to his colleague. Leonov's hands continued to shake. Later, when the photographs from that day were developed and distributed to newspapers across the Union, editors noticed the same strange quality in every single image. Leonov's gaze was never quite focused on the camera. His smile, though present, seemed worn like a mask that did not quite fit. In every shot, his eyes looked past the lens, past the room, past the celebration, as though fixed on something just beyond the frame, something only he could see, something he would never name. The archive building on Korolev Street stood gray and unremarkable among a row of identical Soviet administrative blocks, its windows narrow and its entrance guarded by a single bored militiaman who checked identification cards with mechanical indifference. Inside, the air smelled of old paper, machine oil, and the faint metallic tang of magnetic tape. This was where the official record was kept, where mission data was transformed into history, where the raw chaos of spaceflight became the clean narrative that would be taught to school children and printed in textbooks. Irina Volkova worked on the third floor in a windowless room lined with filing cabinets and reel-to-reel tape machines. She was 24 years old, precise in her habits, trusted with secrets because she had never shown the slightest interest in sharing them. Her job was simple: listen to the recordings, compare them to the written logs, and produce a single unified transcript that would become the permanent record of Voskhod 2's historic mission. She had been working on the Leonov file for 3 days when she found the gap. It was late afternoon, the kind of gray March light that makes Moscow feel like it exists outside of time entirely. Irina sat at her desk with headphones clamped over her ears, listening to the crackle and hiss of ground control communications. The voices were familiar by now. Mission Commander Pavel Belyayev, calm and professional, Leonov himself reporting his status as he prepared for the spacewalk, the flight controllers calling out telemetry data in steady rhythms. She followed along with the written equipment log, a thick ledger filled with timestamps and technical annotations. Everything matched perfectly. Until it didn't. At 14 hours and 6 minutes mission elapsed time, Leonov's voice cut off mid-sentence. The audio went silent. Not dead air, not static. Silent, as though someone had simply stopped the recording. Irina frowned and checked the log. It showed continuous communication from 1406 through 1418. 12 minutes of recorded data. But on the master tape, there was nothing. The time code jumped directly from 1406 to 1418, and Leonov's voice resumed as though nothing had happened. Irina rewound the tape and listened again. The jump was seamless, professionally edited. This was not a malfunction. Malfunctions left artifacts, pops, clicks, degraded sound quality. This was a clean cut, the kind that required intent and skill. She pulled the equipment log closer and ran her finger down the entries for those 12 minutes. Communication continued. Telemetry data was recorded. Ground control issued commands. Leonov responded. all of it documented in careful Cyrillic script, time-stamped and initialed by the monitoring staff. But none of it existed on the tape. She checked the backup reels. They were supposed to be perfect duplicates, recorded simultaneously on separate machines in case of technical failure. She found the first backup and threaded it onto the player. The same gap. 1406 to 1418, missing. She found the second backup, hands moving faster now, a cold prickle of unease spreading across her shoulders. Same gap. 3 separate recording systems, all missing the exact same 12 minutes. Equipment does not fail in perfect synchronization. Equipment does not erase itself in triplicate. Irina sat very still, staring at the silent tape reels. She had worked in this building long enough to understand what she was looking at. This was not an accident. Someone had removed those 12 minutes deliberately, carefully from every copy. But they had forgotten about the written log. Or perhaps they assumed no one would cross-reference closely enough to notice. She felt her pulse quicken, that peculiar mixture of fear and excitement that comes from stumbling onto something you were never meant to see. She knew what she should do. Close the file. Report the discrepancy to her supervisor. Let someone above her pay grade decide what it meant. But Irina had spent 2 years in this archive, and she had learned to read the silences between official statements. She had seen files disappear, heard whispered conversations stop when she entered a room, noticed the careful way certain mission reports were phrased to avoid saying anything concrete. The space program had secrets. Everyone knew that. But this felt different. This felt urgent. She found her supervisor in his office, a narrow room that smelled of cigarette smoke and lukewarm tea. His name was Grigory Mikhailovich, a heavy-set man in his 50s with thinning hair and the permanent expression of someone who had learned to stop asking questions decades ago. Irina stood in the doorway and explained what she had found. The missing minutes, the discrepancy between the audio and the written log, the impossibility of 3 independent systems failing identically. Grigory listened without looking up from his paperwork. When she finished, he set down his pen and met her eyes with a tired, almost paternal patience. "Recording equipment malfunctioned," he said. His voice was flat, final. Irina opened her mouth to argue, to point out the backups, the clean edit, the written record that proved communication had continued, but Grigory raised one hand to stop her. "The equipment malfunctioned. Note the discrepancy in your report and move on. Do you understand?" It was not a question. Irina understood perfectly. She returned to her desk, made the required notation in her report, and continued her work. But before she left that evening, she did something she had never done before. She opened the equipment log to the pages covering 1406 through 1418, laid them flat on the document copier in the corner of the room, and made a single duplicate copy. The machine hummed and flashed, spitting out grainy reproductions of the handwritten entries. She folded the pages twice, slipped them into her coat pocket, and walked out past the bored militiaman into the Moscow dusk. 3 days later, when she returned to continue her work, the equipment log was gone. In its place was a new version, freshly typed, with no entries at all between 1406 and 1418. Just a blank space where 12 minutes used to be. 28 years is a long time to carry a secret. Long enough for the Soviet Union to collapse, for borders to redraw themselves, for men who once feared the knock on the door at midnight to finally speak without looking over their shoulders. Dmitry Kazakov was 61 years old when the Canadian journalist found him in a cramped Kiev apartment that smelled of boiled cabbage and old tobacco. The building was one of those crumbling Khrushchev-era blocks, 5 stories of gray concrete with rusted balconies and windows that rattled in their frames. Kazakov answered the door in a worn cardigan and slippers, his face mapped with deep lines, his eyes roomy but still sharp. He had been a flight engineer at Yevpatoria ground control station during the Voskhod missions, one of the anonymous technicians who monitored telemetry and kept cosmonauts alive from 1,500 kilometers away. He had never spoken publicly about what he witnessed on the 18th of March, 1965. But now, in the chaos of post-Soviet Ukraine, with no one left to threaten him and nothing left to lose, he was ready to talk. The journalist set up a tape recorder on the small kitchen table between them. Kazakov poured 2 glasses of Georgian cognac with shaking hands and drank his in a single swallow before he began. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, as though he still half expected someone to burst through the door and drag him away. He described the control room at Yevpatoria as it was that day. Banks of monitoring equipment, oscilloscopes tracing green lines across dark screens, radio speakers crackling with Leonov's breathing as he prepared to open the airlock. There were 7 technicians on duty, each responsible for different systems. Kazakov monitored the external cameras, grainy black and white feeds from cameras mounted on the spacecraft's hull. The images were poor quality, ghosted and flickering, but clear enough to track Leonov's movements as he emerged from Voskhod 2 and floated into open space. For the first few minutes, everything proceeded normally. Leonov drifted on his tether, a white figure against absolute blackness, moving with the slow grace of a man underwater. Earth curved blue and brilliant below him. The sun blazed from the left edge of the frame. And then something else appeared. Kazakov leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. At first, he thought it was a reflection. Sunlight catching on the spacecraft's metal skin, perhaps, or some artifact of the camera lens. But the light did not behave like a reflection. It appeared in the upper right quadrant of the screen, a small pale glow that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. Kazakov adjusted the contrast, thinking the camera was malfunctioning, but the light remained. It was not harsh or blinding. It was soft, almost organic, the color of old ivory or moonlight on snow. And it was moving. Not drifting passively like debris or floating dust, moving with purpose, with direction, tracking a slow arc across the screen. Kazakov called over his shoulder to the other technicians. 2 of them left their stations and came to look. A third, a young Ukrainian named Oleg, stood behind Kazakov and watched in silence. All 4 of them saw it clearly. The light pulsed, expanded slightly, then contracted. It moved closer to Leonov's drifting figure. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with the slow, deliberate patience of something observing, something curious. No one spoke. The control room filled with a tense electric silence broken only by the hiss of radio static and the beep of telemetry monitors. Kazakov felt his skin prickle with a sensation he couldn't name. Not quite fear, not quite awe, something older and more primal than either. The light continued its slow approach. It stayed just outside the frame's center, always at the periphery, as though deliberately avoiding full visibility. Leonov's voice crackled over the speakers, calm and professional, reporting his status to ground control. He said nothing about the light. Either he couldn't see it from his position, or he chose not to mention it. The camera feed flickered once, twice, then stabilized. The light pulsed again, brighter this time, and Kazakov saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. It had structure. Not the formless glow of reflected sunlight, but edges, contours, a shape that suggested complexity and intention. He leaned closer to the screen, his heart hammering against his ribs, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. And then the door to the control room slammed open. Sergei Pavlovich Korolyov entered like a storm front, his tall frame filling the doorway, his face pale and drawn. The chief designer rarely came to the monitoring stations during missions. He watched from the main control center, surrounded by senior engineers and party officials. But now he was here, moving fast, his eyes locked on the monitors. He didn't ask what they were looking at. He already knew. Kazakov would remember this moment for the rest of his life. Korolev standing behind him, breathing hard, staring at the screen where the pale light pulsed and drifted near Leonov's tiny figure. For 5 seconds, maybe 10, no one moved. Then Korolev spoke, his voice low and absolutely firm. "Shut it down." Kazakov hesitated. Shut what down? The cameras? The telemetry? Korolev didn't repeat himself. He reached past Kazakov and threw a series of switches on the control panel. The monitors went black, all of them simultaneously. The room plunged into a darkness broken only by the faint glow of indicator lights. Korolev turned to face the 4 technicians. His expression wasn't angry. Kazakov had seen Korolev angry before, shouting at engineers who made mistakes, slamming his fist on tables, his face flushed red with fury. This was different. This was fear. Raw, unconcealed, the kind of fear that bypasses all pretense and strikes directly at the brainstem. "You saw nothing," Korolev said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Do you understand? Nothing appeared on these screens. The cameras malfunctioned. You will write that in your reports. You will not discuss this with anyone, not your colleagues, not your families. No one." He looked at each of them in turn, holding their eyes until they nodded. Kazakov nodded. Oleg nodded. The others nodded. What else could they do? This was Korolev, the man who had built the Soviet space program from nothing, who had sent Gagarin into orbit, who answered only to Khrushchev himself. You did not argue with Korolev. You did not question him. The monitors stayed black for 5 minutes, maybe longer. Time became elastic, unreliable. When they were finally reactivated, the screens showed Leonov still drifting on his tether, the curve of Earth below, the sun blazing from the edge of the frame. The light was gone. Kazakov stopped talking. He poured himself another cognac and stared at the glass without drinking. The journalist asked the obvious question. What did he think it was? Kazakov shook his head slowly. He had spent 28 years trying to answer that question. A satellite, perhaps. Some piece of orbital debris catching the sun at an odd angle. But debris does not move with intention. It does not pulse. It does not follow. A hallucination, then, shared by 4 trained technicians simultaneously? Possible, but unlikely. A secret Soviet experiment? Some kind of surveillance device or weapon system that Korolyov wanted kept hidden even from his own staff? Maybe. But if that were true, why the fear in Korolyov's eyes? Why the absolute panic? Kazakov looked at the journalist and spoke the truth he had never dared to speak aloud. I do not know what it was, but I know what I saw, and I know that Korolyov recognized it. He knew what it was the moment he looked at that screen, and whatever it was, it terrified him. Star City in early March was a world unto itself, a sealed compound of training facilities and residential blocks hidden in the pine forests northeast of Moscow, where cosmonauts lived in isolation from ordinary Soviet life. The air smelled of wood smoke and jet fuel. The roads were lined with snow that had turned gray and granular from weeks of trampling. Alexei Leonov had been living there for months, his days consumed by simulations, physical conditioning, and endless technical briefings. He knew every centimeter of the Voskhod capsule, could operate every switch and valve blindfolded, had rehearsed the spacewalk procedure until it played in his dreams. But 2 weeks before launch, he was summoned to a session he had not been expecting, in a building he had never entered before. The psychiatric evaluation facility stood at the edge of the compound, a low structure of yellow brick partially obscured by birch trees. Leonov had passed it countless times without giving it much thought. Cosmonauts underwent regular psychological screening, standard procedure to ensure mental stability under stress, but those sessions were conducted in the main medical building by doctors Leonov knew by name. This was different. The receptionist checked his identification twice before allowing him through, and the waiting room was empty and silent in a way that felt deliberate, as though conversations here were not meant to be overheard. After 10 minutes, a woman in a white coat emerged and introduced herself as Dr. Galina Ostrova. She was perhaps 40, with steel-gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that assessed him with clinical precision. Her handshake was brief and cold. She led him to an office that smelled of disinfectant and old leather, gestured to a chair, and closed the door firmly behind them. The session began normally enough. Dr. Ostrova asked about his sleep patterns, his relationships with fellow cosmonauts, his feelings about the upcoming mission. Leonov answered honestly, accustomed to these intrusions into his mental state. But then the questions shifted. "How would you react?" Dr. Ostrova asked, her pen poised over a notepad, "to encountering an object that defies known physics?" Leonov frowned. What kind of object? She didn't clarify. She simply waited, her expression neutral, for him to answer. He said he would report it to ground control immediately, follow protocol, await instructions. She made a note and continued. "If you encountered something you couldn't explain, something outside your training and experience, would you report it immediately, or would you wait to confirm what you were seeing?" The question felt like a trap. Leonov chose his words carefully. He would observe, assess, then report. "Good," she said, and made another note. The questions grew stranger. Could he distinguish between hallucination and reality under extreme stress? Had he ever experienced visual distortions during high-G maneuvers or pressure chamber training? If he saw something that contradicted his understanding of the physical world, would he trust his senses or trust his knowledge? Leonov felt unease creeping up his spine like cold water. These were not standard questions. They were specific, targeted, as though preparing him for something particular. He asked Dr. Ostrova directly, "What was this about? Why these questions?" She looked at him for a long moment, her face revealing nothing, then said only that the psychological challenges of extravehicular activity were not fully understood. They needed to ensure he could maintain clarity of thought in an environment of absolute isolation. The answer was reasonable. It was also, Leonov sensed, incomplete. The session lasted 90 minutes. When it ended, Dr. Ostrova shook his hand again and told him he had passed with excellent marks. But as he left, she called after him, "Cosmonaut Leonov, if you experience anything unusual during your mission, anything at all, you will report it. But you will also remember that your mind, under sufficient stress, can create very convincing illusions. Do you understand?" He said he understood. He did not. The days before launch blurred together in a haze of final preparation. Leonov moved through simulations and medical checks with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had done these things so many times they had ceased to feel real. But Dr. Ostrova's questions lingered in his mind like splinters, small and irritating and impossible to ignore. Why would they ask about objects that defy physics? What kind of hallucinations were they expecting? On the morning of the 17th of March, one day before launch, Leonov walked through the corridors of the main assembly building, reviewing technical specifications for the airlock system. The building was massive, cathedral-like, filled with the echo of welding torches and the sharp smell of machine oil. Technicians moved in purposeful clusters around the Voskhod capsule, making final adjustments, checking and rechecking every system. Leonov was alone for a moment, lost in thought, when a hand gripped his elbow and pulled him aside into a narrow corridor between equipment racks. The man's name was Viktor Petrov. Leonov knew him by sight, a senior engineer, mid-50s, with a reputation for brilliance and an unsettling intensity that made junior staff avoid him. Viktor's face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes darted toward the main corridor as though checking for observers. He stood too close, his breath coming fast and shallow, and spoke in a harsh whisper that barely qualified as sound. "If you see the light, do not stare at it for too long." The words made no sense. Leonov stared at him. What light? Viktor's grip on his elbow tightened. "Just remember, do not stare. Look away. Keep moving." His voice was urgent, almost pleading, and underneath the urgency was something else, fear, naked and uncontrolled. Leonov tried to ask what he meant, tried to form the question into words, but Viktor released his arm and stepped back as though burned. For a moment they stood there, cosmonaut and engineer, staring at each other in the narrow space between machines. Then Viktor turned and walked away quickly, his footsteps echoing against concrete. Leonov stood alone in the corridor, his heart beating faster than it should. The light. What light? Sunlight? Earthshine? Some technical malfunction Viktor was warning him about? But if it were a technical issue, why deliver the warning in secret, in a whisper, with that look of barely suppressed panic? Leonov considered following him, demanding an explanation, but something stopped him. Some instinct told him that Viktor had already said more than he was supposed to, that pursuing the question would only lead to denials and closed doors. He returned to his quarters that evening and tried to sleep, but the phrase repeated itself in his mind like a stuck record. Do not stare at it for too long. Do not stare. As though staring would be dangerous, as though looking directly at something could harm him in ways he did not yet understand. He thought about mentioning it to Pavel Belyayev, his mission commander, but what would he say? An engineer whispered a cryptic warning about a light? It sounded absurd, paranoid, the kind of superstitious nonsense that had no place in a scientific endeavor. The next morning, Leonov climbed into the Voskhod capsule and felt the hatch seal above him with a final metallic thud. The countdown proceeded. The engines ignited. The rocket lifted him away from Earth on a pillar of fire and thunder, and within minutes he was in orbit, weightless, watching the planet curve away beneath him in swirls of blue and white. He had trained for 2 years for this moment. He knew exactly what to do, exactly what to expect. But as he prepared for the spacewalk, as he checked his suit seals and depressurized the airlock, Viktor's warning echoed in his mind. If you see the light, not if there is a light, if you see it. As though its existence were already certain, as though the only question was whether Leonov would be one of the ones who saw. Belgrade in the autumn of 1972 was a city caught between worlds, officially non-aligned, practically Soviet-influenced, culturally defiant in small ways that Moscow tolerated because Yugoslavia was useful as a buffer and Tito was too stubborn to be controlled completely. The Grand Hotel occupied a corner near the Kalemegdan Fortress, its coffee shop filled each afternoon with diplomats, journalists, and the ever-present listeners who reported back to whichever intelligence service paid them best. It was here, in a corner booth away from the windows, that Alexei Leonov sat across from a journalist named Marko Pavlovich and agreed to speak about things he had never discussed publicly before. Pavlovich was a freelancer who wrote for Italian and German publications, a man with good contacts and better instincts, who knew how to ask questions that sounded innocent but cut straight to the truth. He had requested the interview months earlier, been refused twice, then suddenly received word that Leonov would meet him for 1 hour, off the record, no photographers, no official minders. Pavlovich brought only a small tape recorder, which he placed on the table between them after Leonov gave a slight nod of permission. They talked for 20 minutes about safe subjects, Leonov's current work training younger cosmonauts, his paintings of space, his thoughts on the recent Apollo missions. Leonov was relaxed, charming, the perfect Soviet ambassador to the romance of space exploration. But Pavlovich had not traveled to Belgrade for charm. He waited until Leonov paused to drink his coffee, then asked the question he had come to ask. During your spacewalk in '65, were there moments when you lost contact with ground control? Leonov's hand froze halfway to setting down his cup. The change in his demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. The easy smile vanished. His eyes went flat and distant. He set the cup down carefully and said nothing for several seconds. Then quietly, almost to himself, "There were moments." Pavlovich leaned forward. What happened during those moments? Leonov looked at him, seemed to weigh something internal, then began to speak. "The official account," he said, "describes absolute silence, the void of space, the absence of sound, the profound quiet that comes from floating in a vacuum where there is no air to carry vibration, no medium for noise." That much was true. But silence, Leonov said, is not always empty. He struggled to find the words, his hands moving as though trying to shape something invisible. The silence during those minutes, he didn't say how many, didn't specify when, had texture to it, density. It pressed against him like a physical presence, as though the vacuum itself had weight and intention. He felt observed. Not by the cameras he knew were mounted on the spacecraft, not by the engineers he knew were monitoring his vital signs from the ground. Observed by something else, something outside, something vast. Pavlovich wrote quickly, his pen scratching across the page. How did Leonov know he was being observed? What made him certain it was not simply the disorientation of weightlessness, the psychological effects of isolation that Dr. Ostrova's questions had anticipated? Leonov stopped and stared at his hands, which were clasped together on the table. He was quiet for so long that Pavlovich wondered if he would continue. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely more than a whisper. "You know when you are alone in a room," he said, "and then someone enters behind you. You don't hear them, you don't see them, but you know they are there. Your body knows. Something in your awareness shifts." He looked up, his eyes searching Pavlovich's face. It was like that. But the presence wasn't behind me. It was everywhere, all around. And it was not human. The words hung in the air between them. Pavlovich felt the hairs on his arms rise. He asked the next question carefully, aware that he was approaching territory where Leonov might stop talking entirely. "What did you see?" Leonov closed his eyes. His jaw worked as though chewing on words he didn't want to release. When he opened his eyes again, they were wet. "I saw what I was not supposed to see," Pavlovich pressed. "What does that mean? What exactly did you see?" But Leonov shook his head. He tried several times to begin, his mouth opening and closing, sounds forming but not quite becoming words. Finally, he said, "There are things your mind cannot process, not because you lack intelligence, because the framework does not exist. You see something, and your brain tries to categorize it. Is it metal? Is it light? Is it alive? Is it a machine? But none of those words fit. None of them are adequate. So your mind just records, takes a photograph it cannot develop, stores it somewhere you cannot access." He paused, his breathing uneven. "I remember seeing it. I remember the moment. But when I try to describe what it was, the words fall apart. They do not work. It is like trying to explain color to someone born blind." His hands were shaking now, the same fine tremor that had plagued him at the first press conference 7 years earlier. Pavlovich could feel the interview slipping away from him. He asked another question quickly, trying to anchor Leonov before he retreated entirely. "Did ground control know? Did you report what you saw?" Leonov laughed, a short, bitter sound without humor. "I tried. The radio was dead, or I thought it was dead. Later they told me communication was perfect, uninterrupted, that I had been talking to them the whole time. But I remember silence. I remember screaming into the microphone and hearing nothing back. I remember floating there, turning slowly and seeing..." He stopped abruptly. His face had gone pale. Pavlovich waited, barely breathing. "Seen what?" But Leonov stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Several heads turned in the coffee shop. He looked down at Pavlovich with an expression that was equal parts apology and panic. "I cannot do this," he said. His voice was unsteady. "I thought I could, but I cannot." He turned and walked toward the exit without looking back. Pavlovich sat alone at the table, staring at the tape recorder still turning quietly between the coffee cups. He had gotten something extraordinary, a confession, a glimpse behind the propaganda, evidence that the official story of humanity's first spacewalk was incomplete at best. He rewound the tape partially and listened to Leonov's voice describing the silence that had texture, the presence that was not human. This was publishable. This was important. He returned to his small flat near the university and transcribed the entire interview that same evening, his fingers flying across the typewriter keys. He made 2 copies, one for his editor in Rome, one for his own files. The next morning, he went to the post office to send the package. He never made it. 2 men in dark coats intercepted him 3 blocks from his building. They identified themselves as Yugoslav state security, but spoke Russian with Moscow accents. They were polite, but absolutely firm. The tape, the transcript, and all copies. Now. Pavlovich tried to argue. They were not interested in arguments. One of them opened his coat just enough to show the pistol holstered there. Not a threat, precisely. Just information. Pavlovich handed over everything. The men went to his flat and searched it thoroughly, professionally, finding the second copy he had hidden in a hollowed-out book. They took his notes. They took the tape recorder. They took the original cassette and, after a moment's consideration, the entire box of blank cassettes as well, just in case. Then they left without another word. Pavlovich stood in his ransacked apartment and understood with the cold clarity of someone who has just glimpsed the machinery that runs beneath the surface of things, that he had touched something he was never meant to touch. He never wrote about the interview. He never mentioned it to colleagues. He moved to West Germany the following year and worked for a financial newspaper, writing about bond markets and currency exchange rates, safe, boring subjects that no one would kill him for investigating. But he remembered. He remembered Leonov's shaking hands and wet eyes. He remembered the way his voice broke when he said, "I saw what I was not supposed to see." And he remembered, most of all, the fear. Not fear of the Soviets or the security services. Fear of the memory itself, of the thing that Leonov had seen and could not name, that lived in his mind like a photograph that refused to develop. Irina Volkova had always believed that archives were truthful places, not in the propaganda sense. She was not naive enough to think official documents told the whole story, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. Archives were permanent. They were the bedrock beneath the shifting sands of political narrative. You could lie in newspapers, distort facts in speeches, rewrite history in textbooks. But the raw documents, the original records locked away in temperature-controlled rooms, those remained unchanged. Or so she had thought. The missing 12 minutes had shattered that belief, and now, 3 weeks after she had hidden the copied log sheets in her apartment, Irina could not stop looking for the cracks in the official story. She worked carefully, never asking direct questions, never drawing attention to her interest. During her lunch breaks, she would request files that seemed unrelated to Voskhod too. Equipment maintenance logs, personnel schedules, budget reports, but which might contain incidental mentions of the mission. She cross-referenced dates, tracked which engineers were on duty when, noted discrepancies in timekeeping. It was slow, meticulous work, the kind that required patience and an eye for detail. Irina had both. She began to notice patterns. Certain files that should have existed were simply missing from the catalog. Requisition forms referenced documents by number, but when she looked up those numbers, she found empty folders or papers that had nothing to do with the mission. It was as though someone had gone through the archives systematically, pulling anything that might be sensitive, leaving holes that only became visible if you knew where to look. Then she found Leonov's medical file. It was a routine request. She needed to verify the timeline of his post-mission debriefing for the official record. The file was thick, full of physical examination results, blood work, cardiovascular stress tests, the usual documentation of a cosmonaut's health before and after flight. Irina flipped through the pages mechanically until something caught her eye. The page numbers. They jumped. Page 17, page 18, then page 22. Pages 19 through 21 were missing. She checked the binding. No torn edges, no sign that pages had been removed roughly. This was a clean extraction, professional. But whoever had done it had forgotten to renumber the remaining pages. Irina felt her pulse quicken. She looked more closely at page 18 and page 22, reading the content that bordered the gap. Page 18 ended mid-sentence with a note about routine post-mission observation period. Page 22 began with cosmonaut exhibited normal recovery patterns and no lasting effects. Normal recovery from what? Irina requested Leonov's backup medical file. There were supposed to be duplicates of all cosmonaut health records kept in a separate facility in case of fire or loss. It took 4 days for the request to be processed, longer than usual. When the file finally arrived, she opened it immediately and turned to the same section. Pages 19 through 21 were present. She read them with her office door closed and her hands trembling slightly. The original entries, written in the cramped handwriting of the chief medical officer, described post-mission visual disturbances reported by subject upon return to consciousness. Another entry noted acute disorientation upon re-entry, subject unable to accurately report sequence of events during EVA. A third mentioned recommended extended psychological observation due to inconsistent debriefing responses. These were not normal. These were not routine. These were the notations of a man who had experienced something the doctors could not easily explain. Irina made photocopies of the 3 pages, her hands working quickly, the machine's light flashing across the text. She returned the backup file and compared the 2 versions side by side in her apartment that evening. In the altered file, the replacement pages described a flawless psychological recovery, perfect clarity, no visual disturbances, no disorientation. The cosmonaut was healthy, stable, ready for immediate public appearances. It was exactly the kind of report that would allow Leonov to be paraded before cameras and foreign dignitaries without anyone asking uncomfortable questions. But it was also demonstrably a lie. Someone had rewritten the medical record to hide whatever had actually happened to Leonov during or immediately after his spacewalk. And that someone had access to official files, to the archive itself, to the machinery of record-keeping. This was not some rogue technician covering up a mistake. This was institutional, authorized, a deliberate falsification of history. She went deeper. Over the next 2 weeks, Irina requested every training document related to Voskhod 2. Safety protocols, emergency procedures, contingency plans. Most were exactly what she expected. Plans for equipment failure, medical emergencies, loss of communication. But buried in a folder labeled Supplementary Training Materials, she found a reference that made her breath catch. It was a single line in a training schedule from February 1965. Cosmonaut Leonov, Protocol 17 briefing, 1400 hours, Building 7. Protocol 17. She had never heard of it. She checked the master index of all official space program protocols. Protocol 17 did not exist. The list jumped from Protocol 16, emergency re-entry procedures, to Protocol 18, radiation exposure contingencies. There was no 17. But here it was, referenced casually in a training schedule as though it were perfectly normal, perfectly routine. Irina searched for any other mention of Protocol 17. She found 3 more references over the next week. A requisition form requesting specialized equipment per Protocol 17 specifications. A personnel note indicating that Dr. Galina Ostrova had completed Protocol 17 assessment with satisfactory results. An equipment log showing that Protocol 17 monitoring station had been activated on the 18th of March at 0900 hours, 3 hours before Leonov's spacewalk. But when she tried to find the actual protocol document, the thing itself, she hit walls. The reference numbers led to folders that were empty or misfiled. The equipment specifications were redacted, entire paragraphs blacked out with heavy ink. The monitoring station logs had pages missing, the same clean professional removal she had seen in Leonov's medical file. It was as though Protocol 17 existed in the margins of documentation, visible only in reflections and shadows, never directly. She made notes. She copied every reference she could find. She built a timeline that showed Protocol 17 was not some minor procedural detail. but a significant, deliberate element of the Voskhod 2 mission. It had its own equipment, its own assessment criteria, its own monitoring station that operated separately from standard mission control. And it was connected somehow to those 12 missing minutes. Irina knew she was approaching a line she should not cross. She felt it in the way her supervisor had started looking at her lately, his eyes lingering on her desk when he walked past, his questions about her current work assignments growing more pointed. She felt it in the way certain files now took longer to retrieve, as though someone was checking what she requested before approving access. She should have stopped. She should have let it go, accepted that some secrets were meant to stay buried. But she was 24 years old, and she had spent 2 years filing other people's truths, and she wanted just once to know something real. Then Grigory Mikhailovich called her into his office. It was a Thursday afternoon, gray light filtering through dirty windows, the building quiet in that suspended way it got near the end of the workday. Grigory sat behind his desk with his hands folded, his expression gentle and sad. "Irina Sergeyevna," he said, using her patronymic in the formal way that meant bad news was coming. "You are being reassigned." The words felt unreal. Reassigned where? Why? Grigory slid a paper across the desk. Transfer orders. To Vladivostok, the far eastern edge of the Soviet Union, 6 time zones away from Moscow, to a regional archive that processed fishing fleet documentation. Effective in 1 week. The orders were already signed, already approved, already inevitable. Irina stared at the paper and felt something collapse inside her chest. "This is because of the files," she said quietly. It was not a question. Grigory did not insult her intelligence by denying it. He simply said, "You are a talented archivist. You will do good work in Vladivostok." His voice was kind. His eyes were tired. He had probably argued against this, probably tried to protect her, and lost. Irina returned to her desk in a daze. She had 1 week. 1 week before they shipped her to the edge of the world, before someone else took over her position and discovered, or did not discover, or pretended not to discover, all the missing pieces she had found. That evening, she went home and gathered every photocopy, every note, every scrap of evidence she had accumulated. She put it all in a large envelope, sealed it, and wrote a single name on the front. Marko Pavlovich, care of the Yugoslav embassy. She had no idea if he would receive it. She had no idea if it would matter. But it was the only thing she could think to do. She mailed it the next morning from a post office far from her apartment, far from the archive, far from anyone who might be watching. Then she went to work, finished her final week with quiet efficiency, and boarded a train to Vladivostok, carrying a single suitcase and the knowledge that Protocol 17 was real, that the 12 minutes were real, and that someone very powerful wanted both to remain hidden forever. By the mid-1970s, Alexei Leonov had become more symbol than ma'am. His image appeared on postage stamps and commemorative medals. School children recited his achievements in history class. Foreign dignitaries requested audiences with him when they visited Moscow, wanting to shake the hand that had touched the void. He was the embodiment of Soviet achievement, proof that communist will could conquer even the hostility of space itself. Leonov played the role with practiced skill. He gave speeches at universities and military academies, his voice warm and confident, describing the beauty of Earth seen from above, the profound silence of the cosmos, the duty every citizen owed to the advancement of science. He wrote a memoir that became a bestseller, full of technical details and patriotic sentiment. He painted, oils on canvas, vivid scenes of spacecraft against star fields, Earth's blue curve bisected by the razor edge of the horizon. The paintings sold well. Everything he touched became legend. But those who worked closely with him noticed the careful architecture of his public persona, the ways certain subjects were navigated around like rocks in a channel. During interviews, foreign journalists would sometimes ask about the spacewalk itself, probing for details beyond the official narrative. Had there been any moments of fear? Any unexpected difficulties? Anything unusual? Leonov's answers to these questions followed a pattern. He would smile, acknowledge that space travel was always challenging, mention the suit inflation problem that nearly prevented his re-entry. This was documented, acceptable, a story of Soviet engineering overcoming adversity, and then smoothly redirect to safer topics. If pressed, his responses became abstract, philosophical. Space changed a man's perspective, he would say. It made you see humanity's place in the universe differently. Beautiful words that said nothing specific. Journalists would nod and move on, satisfied they had gotten something profound, even if they could not quite articulate what. His fellow cosmonauts saw a different version of Leonov. In the private dining halls of Star City, in the training facilities where cameras were not allowed, he was gregarious and generous, quick to laugh, always ready with a story or a toast. But certain conversational territories were clearly marked as forbidden. Cosmonaut Vitaly Sevastyanov once asked him casually whether he had experienced any perceptual distortions during the walk, disorientation, visual artifacts, the kind of sensory confusion that isolation and stress could produce. Leonov's face had frozen for just a moment, his smile holding, but his eyes going distant. "Nothing beyond normal mission parameters," he had said, and changed the subject so deftly that Sevastyanov barely noticed the evasion until hours later. Another time, during a technical debriefing for a planned Soyuz mission, an engineer asked whether Leonov had noticed any unusual electromagnetic interference during his EVA. The question was routine, part of standard data collection. Leonov's hands clenched briefly on the table edge. "The equipment functioned perfectly," he said. The engineer pressed, "Yes, but were there any anomalies in your suit radio? Any static or signal degradation?" Leonov stood abruptly. "I have another meeting," he said, and left the room. Georgy Grechko had known Leonov for years, trained alongside him, flown missions that Leonov helped prepare. They were not close friends. Cosmonauts maintained a certain professional distance, but they were colleagues, brothers in the small fraternity of men who had left Earth and returned. In the winter of 1976, both men attended a celebration at the Cosmonaut Training Center marking the 15th anniversary of Gagarin's flight. The evening had started formally with speeches and official toasts, but as the night wore on and the vodka flowed more freely, formality dissolved into the warm camaraderie of shared experience. Grechko and Leonov found themselves sitting together at a corner table, glasses full, ties loosened, talking about nothing in particular. The room around them buzzed with conversation and laughter. Leonov had drunk more than usual. His face was flushed, his movements slightly uncoordinated. He was telling a story about a training accident, something harmless and funny, when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. His expression changed. The jovial mask slipped, and underneath, Grechko saw something raw and exhausted. Leonov leaned forward across the small table, close enough that Grechko could smell the vodka on his breath, and spoke in a whisper barely audible over the surrounding noise. "I was not alone out there, Georgie." His eyes were unfocused, looking past Grechko's shoulder at something invisible. "I was never alone." The words hung between them, heavy and strange. Grechko felt a chill run down his back, despite the warmth of the room. He set down his glass carefully. "What do you mean, Alexei? Who was with you?" But Leonov's face had already gone blank, as though a switch had been thrown. The rawness vanished. His eyes refocused. He blinked several times, looked at Grechko as though seeing him for the first time, and stood abruptly. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Forgive me," Leonov muttered. "I need air." He walked toward the exit with careful, controlled steps, a drunk man pretending to be sober. Grechko watched him go and did not follow. He sat alone at the table for several minutes, staring at Leonov's abandoned glass. "I was not alone." What did that mean? A hallucination? A metaphor? Or something literal, something that had actually been there in the void with him? Grechko felt an urge to go after Leonov, to corner him somewhere private and demand a real explanation. But something stopped him. An instinct, perhaps, or a recognition that certain doors, once opened, could not be closed again. He stayed in his chair. Leonov did not return to the celebration. The next time Grechko saw him, 3 days later, in the hallway of the training center, Leonov greeted him warmly, clapped him on the shoulder, asked about his family. No mention of the celebration. No acknowledgement of what he had whispered across the table. Grechko tested the waters carefully, making a vague reference to their conversation. Leonov looked at him blankly. "We talked about many things that night," he said, with a pleasant smile. "I am afraid I do not remember specifics." "Too much vodka, I think." The door was closed. Grechko never tried to open it again, but the moment stayed with him, sharp and clear in his memory, impossible to dismiss. Years later, in bed beside his wife on a night when sleep would not come, he told her about it. About Leonov's whisper, his blank face, the way he had fled the room. His wife listened quietly, then asked what Grechko thought it meant. He had no answer. But he told her something else, something he hadn't planned to say until the words were already out. He looked like a man carrying a secret that was slowly killing him. His wife asked if he thought Leonov was ill, if perhaps he needed help. Grechko shook his head. Not that kind of illness. Not something doctors could treat. Leonov was being consumed by knowledge, by something he knew and could not speak, could not share, could not escape. It lived in him like a parasite, feeding on his silence, growing stronger with every evasion and careful deflection. Over the following decades, Grechko would occasionally see Leonov at official functions, anniversaries, reunions of the cosmonaut corps. Each time, Leonov was charming, articulate, the perfect representative of Soviet space achievement. He aged gracefully, his hair graying, but his posture still military straight, his handshake still firm. He gave interviews to international media, appeared in documentaries about the space race, received honors from foreign governments. And each time, Grechko looked for traces of the man who had whispered across that table in 1976, the man whose mask had slipped for just a moment. Sometimes he thought he saw it, a flicker in Leonov's eyes when a certain question was asked, a tension in his jaw when someone mentioned the word anomaly, a microsecond pause before launching into another well-rehearsed answer. But mostly, Leonov was impenetrable, locked behind layers of charm and legend. Grechko came to understand that whatever Leonov had experienced during those 12 minutes, whatever had prompted that drunken confession, was something Leonov had chosen to bury so deeply that even he could no longer access it without great cost. It was sealed away, locked in a compartment of his mind that only vodka could occasionally breach. And perhaps that was how Leonov survived, by building walls, by dividing himself into the public hero and the private man who knew too much, and never letting the two meet. Grechko wondered sometimes what would happen if those walls ever failed completely, if the secret Leonov carried finally broke through and demanded to be spoken. But Leonov's discipline held. Year after year, interview after interview, the walls stood firm. The cosmonaut who had touched the void smiled for cameras, signed autographs, told approved stories, and kept his silence. And the thing he would not name, the presence he had felt in the darkness, remained locked away where only he could see it, patient and waiting, slowly consuming him from within. Pavel Sokolov was 73 years old when he decided that silence had outlived its usefulness. The cancer had started in his lungs, decades of Soviet cigarettes finally extracting their price, and metastasized to his liver and bones. The doctors gave him 6 months, maybe 8 if he was lucky and the chemotherapy worked better than expected. Pavel declined the chemotherapy. He had spent 30 years carrying a secret that felt heavier than the tumor growing inside him, and he wanted to die lighter than he had lived. In the spring of 2004, he contacted his grandson Dmitry, a university student who ran a small YouTube channel dedicated to Cold War mysteries and declassified documents. Pavel told him he had a story. Dmitry brought a camera to his grandfather's cramped Moscow apartment, set it up on a tripod in the kitchen, and pressed record. Pavel sat in a wooden chair with his hands folded in his lap, his frame skeletal beneath a cardigan that had fit him properly 6 months earlier. His voice was hoarse but steady as he explained that he had worked at the State Film Archive from 1971 to 1998, cataloging and preserving footage from Soviet space missions, propaganda films, newsreels, and classified military documentation. It was careful, meticulous work that required security clearance and absolute discretion. The archive occupied a converted warehouse in the industrial district near Izmailovo, a building with reinforced vaults and climate-controlled storage rooms where thousands of film canisters sat in careful rows, labeled and indexed according to a system only archivists understood. Pavel had loved the work. He loved the smell of celluloid and chemical preservatives, the quiet ritual of threading film through projectors, the ghostly flicker of images from decades past projected onto white walls in darkened rooms. In the winter of 1974, Pavel was working a night shift, alone in the archive except for a security guard who spent most of his time sleeping in the front office. Night shifts were Pavel's favorite. No supervisors, no interruptions, just hours of solitude among the reels. He was cataloging footage from the Voskhod program, going through canisters one by one to verify their contents matched the written inventory. Most were exactly as labeled: launch sequences, training footage, press conferences. But one canister caught his attention. It was sealed with red wax, something he had never seen before on archival materials. The label read, Voskhod 2, External Camera, Segment 4, in neat typed letters, followed by a classification code he did not recognize. Pavel checked the inventory. Segment 4 was not listed. According to the official records, there were only 3 segments of external camera footage from Voskhod 2. This canister should not exist. Curiosity overrode caution. Pavel broke the wax seal, opened the canister, and found a single reel of 16mm film inside. He carried it to the screening room, a small space with a projector and a pull-down screen, and threaded the film carefully through the machine. The footage began normally enough. Grainy black-and-white images showed Leonov emerging from the airlock, his white suit stark against the absolute blackness of space. The camera angle was fixed, mounted somewhere on the spacecraft's exterior, looking out at the cosmonaut as he floated on his tether. Pavel watched Leonov drift and turn, his movements slow and dreamlike in zero gravity. Earth curved brilliant and cloud-streaked in the lower portion of the frame. The sun blazed from the upper left, too bright to look at directly. For the first 2 minutes, it was exactly what Pavel expected: historic footage of humanity's first spacewalk, technically significant, but visually unremarkable. Then something else appeared. At first, Pavel thought it was a flaw in the film, a light leak or chemical degradation. But as he watched, he realized it was part of the recorded image. A shape. It entered from the right side of the frame, moving slowly, deliberately, luminous. Not the harsh white of reflected sunlight, but a softer glow, almost pearlescent, the color of moonlight on water. The shape was oblong, irregular, difficult to define precisely because it seemed to exist slightly out of focus even when the rest of the frame was sharp. Pavel leaned closer to the screen, his heart beating faster. The shape moved across the frame with a fluid, purposeful motion that was nothing like drifting debris. It maintained a consistent distance from Leonov, tracking parallel to his movement, staying always at the periphery of the camera's view as though deliberately avoiding the center of the frame. Pavel watched Leonov's figure for any reaction, any indication that the cosmonaut could see what the camera was recording. Leonov's posture changed subtly. His head turned slightly, his body rotated on the tether, but whether this was in response to the shape or simply normal movement was impossible to determine. The luminous form pulsed once, growing fractionally brighter, then dimmer, then brighter again. It had structure. Pavel could see edges, contours, suggestions of complexity that his eyes could not quite resolve into coherent form. Not a satellite, not debris, not any kind of spacecraft he had ever seen. The shape remained in frame for approximately 40 seconds. Pavel timed it on his watch, then slowly drifted out of view to the left. The footage continued for another 30 seconds, showing only Leonov and the curve of Earth, then ended abruptly. The film leader flapped against the projector. Pavel sat in the darkness, listening to the rhythmic slap of film, his mind racing. He rewound the reel and watched it again. The shape appeared at exactly the same moment, moved with exactly the same deliberate grace, pulsed with exactly the same rhythm. On the third viewing, Pavel focused on the details, trying to capture every nuance. The way the luminosity seemed to emanate from within rather than reflect external light. The way it maintained position relative to Leonov even as both cosmonaut and spacecraft moved through their orbit. The way it appeared to possess volume and depth despite the two-dimensional limitations of the film. He was certain of one thing. This was not a camera artifact, not a flaw in processing, not debris catching sunlight at an unusual angle. This was something real, something that had been there in space with Leonov, something that had been recorded and then hidden away in a sealed canister that did not officially exist. Pavel left the screening room as the eastern sky was beginning to lighten. He returned the film to its canister, resealed it as best he could, and placed it back exactly where he had found it. He told himself he would mention it to his supervisor in the morning, ask about the classification code, try to understand what he had seen. But when he arrived for his next shift 2 days later, the canister was gone. He checked the shelf 3 times, looked in adjacent storage areas, searched through the inventory logs. Nothing. It had vanished completely, as though it had never existed. Pavel found his supervisor, a dour Georgian named Avtandil, and asked carefully about the Voskhod 2 footage. Avtandil looked at him with flat, expressionless eyes. "We have 3 segments," he said, "all properly inventoried." Pavel mentioned segment 4. Avtandil's expression did not change. "There is no segment 4. He held Pavel's gaze for a long moment, then added quietly, "And if there were, it would be classified beyond your clearance. Do you understand?" Pavel understood. He nodded, returned to his cataloging work, and never mentioned the footage again. Not to colleagues, not to friends, not to his wife. He carried it silently for 3 decades, the memory of that luminous shape moving deliberately across the screen, pulsing with its own internal light. Now, dying in his kitchen with his grandson's camera recording, he spoke it aloud for the first time. His voice was matter-of-fact, devoid of embellishment or interpretation. He simply described what he had seen. Dmitry asked the obvious questions. What did Pavel think it was? Did he believe it was extraterrestrial? Pavel shook his head slowly. "I do not know what it was," he said, "but I know it was not debris. I know it was not a reflection. It moved with intention. It had purpose. And someone wanted it erased from history." The interview lasted 23 minutes. Dmitry uploaded it to his YouTube channel that same evening with the title, "Former Soviet Archivist Reveals Hidden Voskhod 2 Footage." Within 48 hours, 17,000 people had viewed the video. Comments flooded in, skeptics demanding proof, believers citing it as validation of conspiracy theories, researchers asking for more details. Dmitry received messages from documentary filmmakers and journalists requesting interviews with his grandfather. Pavel watched the view count climb with a mixture of satisfaction and unease. He had expected some attention, but this felt larger, more volatile than he had anticipated. Then, on the third day after upload, the video disappeared. No warning, no explanation. The page simply showed an error message. This video has been removed for violating YouTube's terms of service. Dmitry tried to contact YouTube support. His emails went unanswered. He tried to re-upload the video. The upload failed repeatedly with vague error messages. He uploaded it to other platforms, Vimeo, Dailymotion, a Russian video hosting site. Each version was removed within hours. Pavel died 6 weeks later, the secret finally spoken, but already disappeared back into the silence that had held it for 30 years. Dmitry kept a copy of the interview on a hard drive hidden away, occasionally watching it alone in his apartment. He never tried to upload it again. The message was clear. Some stories were not meant to be told, no matter how many years had passed, no matter who was willing to speak them. The luminous shape that Pavel had seen moving across that screen in 1974 remained hidden, locked away in vaults that might no longer exist, in canisters that were never inventoried, in the memory of a dead man whose testimony had been erased as efficiently as the 12 minutes of radio communication. The footage, if it still existed somewhere, waited in darkness, patient, silent, keeping its secrets the way the void itself keeps secrets, absolutely, eternally, without explanation or apology. Viktor Petrov died on a gray November morning in 1981, his heart giving out while he sat at his workbench in the small dacha he had built with his own hands 30 kilometers outside Moscow. He was found by his daughter Elena, who had come to visit and found the door unlocked, the wood stove cold, her father slumped forward over a half-assembled radio, his tools still scattered across the scarred wooden surface. He was 62 years old. The official cause of death was myocardial infarction, unremarkable for a man who had smoked 2 packs of cigarettes daily and subsisted largely on black bread, salted fish, and vodka. The funeral was small, attended by a handful of former colleagues from the space program and neighbors from the dacha community. He was buried in a cemetery outside Kaliningrad on a day when rain turned the pathways to mud and the priest rushed through the liturgy with his collar turned up against the cold. Elena was Viktor's only child, 34 years old, unmarried, a mathematics teacher at a Moscow secondary school. She had loved her father in the complicated way children love difficult parents, aware of his brilliance, frustrated by his silences, never quite able to bridge the distance he maintained between himself and the rest of humanity. Viktor had been a senior propulsion engineer during the early space program, part of the team that had designed the launch systems for Vostok and Voskhod. He had worked directly under Korolyov, had been present for Gagarin's launch, had helped troubleshoot the systems that kept cosmonauts alive in the void. But he rarely spoke of those years. When Elena asked about his work, he would offer technical details, thrust ratios, fuel mixtures, structural tolerances, but never stories, never the human dimension. It was as though his career existed in a separate compartment of his life, sealed away, accessible only through the language of mathematics and physics. After the funeral, Elena spent weeks sorting through her father's possessions. The dacha was cluttered with decades of accumulated debris, old journals, broken equipment, half-finished projects that Viktor had started and abandoned. His workshop occupied a converted shed behind the main house, a cramped space that smelled of solder and machine oil, its walls lined with shelves holding components scavenged from radios and televisions. Viktor had spent his retirement tinkering, building devices whose purpose Elena could not determine, filling notebooks with calculations that meant nothing to her. She worked methodically, dividing things into piles, to keep, to donate, to discard. Most of it was junk, but she felt obligated to examine everything, to touch each object her father had touched, as though proximity to his tools might finally reveal the man himself. She found the notebook on a cold afternoon in late December, wedged behind a loose board in the workshop wall. It was small, bound in cracked leather, the kind of field notebook Soviet engineers carried for quick notes and sketches. Elena pulled it free and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with her father's handwriting, that distinctive cramped script she recognized from birthday cards and shopping lists. Technical diagrams covered most pages, circuit designs, antenna configurations, what looked like telemetry calculations. She flipped through without much interest until a date caught her eye. March 18th, 1965, the day of Leonov's spacewalk. She had been 9 years old then, remembered watching the broadcast on their neighbor's television, remembered her father's absence that day, how he had not come home until very late, how when he finally arrived, he had looked pale and distant and refused to eat dinner. The entry was brief, written in Russian, the letters darker than the surrounding pages, as though Viktor had pressed the pen harder than usual. Elena read it standing in the cold workshop, her breath misting in the air, her father's words bridging 16 years between his death and the moment he had written them. The anomaly appeared at 14:09. It maintained parallel trajectory for 11 minutes. Visual confirmation from 3 independent sources. Chief Designer ordered full blackout. We were told it was a test. I do not believe him. Something was waiting for us out there. Something has always been waiting. The notebook trembled in Elena's hands. She read the entry again, trying to make sense of it. The anomaly. What anomaly? Parallel trajectory to what? Visual confirmation of what? The words were precise, but their meaning was opaque, as though Viktor had written in code, recording facts without context. She turned the page. The rest of the notebook contained only technical notes, nothing personal, nothing that explained the March 18th entry. Elena brought the notebook back to her Moscow apartment and spent the evening reading it cover to cover, searching for other clues. She found none. The March entry stood alone, an island of alarming specificity in a sea of technical abstraction. She considered showing it to her mother, but her parents had divorced when Elena was 12 and barely spoke to each other. Her mother would not care about an old notebook. Elena considered simply keeping it, filing it away with the few other mementos she had decided to preserve. But the entry haunted her. Something was waiting for us out there. Her father had written those words the same day Leonov became a hero, the same day the Soviet Union celebrated its triumph over the cosmos. What had Viktor seen? What had made him write that strange, unsettling phrase? And why had he hidden the notebook behind a wall? After 2 weeks of uncertainty, Elena contacted a journalist she knew slightly, a colleague's husband who wrote for Izvestia. His name was Sergei Orlov, a cautious man in his 40s who specialized in historical features, the kind of safe retrospectives the Soviet press allowed. Elena met him in a cafe near Pushkin Square and showed him the notebook. Sergei read the March entry 3 times, his expression growing more troubled with each reading. "Your father worked on Voskhod too?" Elena nodded. "Do you know what this refers to? The anomaly?" Elena shook her head. Sergei closed the notebook carefully and pushed it back across the table. "I cannot write about this," he said. His voice was apologetic but firm. "Even if I wanted to, no editor would publish it. Space program materials are sensitive, classified. You are talking about suggesting something irregular happened during a historic mission." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If this is real, if your father actually witnessed something, then it is exactly the kind of thing the state prefers to keep quiet." But Sergei made a phone call. He knew a historian at Moscow State University, a specialist in Soviet aerospace development named Dr. Anatoly Kuzmin. Perhaps he could provide context, help Elena understand what her father had written. Dr. Kuzmin agreed to meet. He was a small, precise man with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers, his office buried deep in the university's history department, surrounded by stacks of documents and technical journals. Elena showed him the notebook. Dr. Kuzmin studied the March 18th entry for a long time, occasionally making small sounds, hums and clicks that might have indicated interest or skepticism. Finally, he looked up. "Where did you find this?" Elena explained. Dr. Kuzmin asked if she had shown it to anyone else. "Only Sergei," she said. Dr. Kuzmin nodded slowly. "May I keep this for a few days? I would like to verify some details." Elena hesitated, reluctant to part with the notebook, but agreed. Dr. Kuzmin returned it a week later. He had made photocopies of several pages, including the March entry. He told Elena that he had contacted 3 former space program officials, shown them the text, asked for comment. None would speak on the record. One had hung up immediately when Dr. Kuzmin mentioned 1409 on March 18th. Another had said only, "That material remains classified," before ending the call. The third had been more forthcoming, though still cryptic. "If such an event occurred," the man had said carefully, "it would have been handled at the highest levels of authority. Engineers would have been instructed not to discuss it. The fact that your historian has this notebook means someone violated security protocols. That is unfortunate." Then he too had hung up. Dr. Kuzmin returned the notebook to Elena and advised her, gently but clearly, to keep it private. "This is historically significant," he said, "but it is also dangerous. Your father wrote something he was not supposed to write. The fact that he hid it suggests he knew that." Elena left Dr. Kuzmin's office with the notebook in her bag, feeling more confused and unsettled than before. She had hoped for answers, for someone to explain what her father had meant, to provide context that would make the entry comprehensible. Instead, she had found only more silence, more evasion, a wall of refusal that suggested her father's words touched something too sensitive to acknowledge. She kept the notebook for another year, occasionally taking it out to reread the March entry, trying to imagine what Viktor had seen that day, what had frightened him enough to break protocol and write it down. Then, in 1983, she made a decision. She donated the notebook to the Museum of Cosmonautics in Moscow, along with a letter explaining its provenance and requesting that it be preserved as part of the historical record. The museum accepted the donation. A curator sent Elena a polite acknowledgement letter thanking her for contributing to the preservation of Soviet space history. The notebook was catalogued, assigned an accession number, and placed in the museum's archival storage. It was never displayed. Researchers who specifically requested to view materials related to Viktor Petrov were told that the collection contained only technical documents of limited historical interest. The notebook remained in a climate-controlled vault, sealed in acid-free packaging, filed under a catalog number that appeared in no public index. Elena visited the museum once, 2 years after the donation, and asked to see her father's notebook. The archivist checked the computer system and frowned. "I am sorry," she said. "That item is currently restricted for conservation purposes." Elena asked when it would be available. The archivist could not say. Elena never asked again. Her father's confession, written in cramped handwriting on a cold March evening 16 years before his death, remained hidden. The anomaly he had witnessed, the thing that had waited in the void and maintained its parallel trajectory for 11 minutes, stayed locked away with the notebook, patient and silent, its existence preserved in words that no one was allowed to read. The George R. Brown Convention Center in Houston was vast and modern, all glass and steel and air conditioning that fought against the brutal Texas summer heat outside. The International Astronautical Congress of 1998 had drawn over 3,000 attendees from 40 countries, engineers, scientists, astronauts, cosmonauts, aerospace executives, and academics who studied the business of leaving Earth. The main auditorium seated 1,500, and on the afternoon of October 13th, it was nearly full for a panel discussion titled Pioneers of Space Exploration, Reflections on the Early Years. Alexei Leonov sat at the center of a long table on the stage, flanked by American astronaut Buzz Aldrin and Chinese taikonaut Yang Liwei. Leonov was 64 years old, his hair white but still thick, his shoulders broad despite the slight stoop that age had imposed. He wore a dark suit and a tie decorated with small embroidered spacecraft. When he spoke, his English was accented but fluent, his voice still strong. The panel had proceeded predictably for 90 minutes. Questions about training, about the differences between American and Soviet approaches, about what it felt like to experience weightlessness for the first time. Leonov had answered with practiced charm, offering anecdotes that were both personal and safe, stories he had told dozens of times before. The audience laughed at the appropriate moments. Cameras flashed. Everything was cordial, professional, exactly what a space conference panel should be. Then, during the question and answer session, a woman stood up in the third row. She was perhaps 40, with short graying hair and glasses, wearing credentials that identified her as Dr. Sara Chen from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. She held a microphone that trembled slightly in her hand, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the auditorium speakers. "Mr. Leonov, did you experience any unexplained phenomena during your spacewalk?" the question hung in the air like a challenge. The room, which had been filled with the ambient noise of hundreds of people, whispered conversations, rustling papers, the hum of ventilation, went suddenly profoundly quiet. On stage, Buzz Aldrin glanced sideways at Leonov, his expression carefully neutral. The moderator, a NASA administrator, opened his mouth as though to redirect the question, then closed it again. Leonov sat very still. His hands, which had been gesturing expansively moments before, settled flat on the table in front of him. He stared at Dr. Chen for what felt like a very long time. 5 seconds. 10. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not defensive, simply blank, as though some internal calculation was taking place behind his eyes. The silence stretched. Someone coughed. A chair creaked. 1,500 people waited. When Leonov finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, each word chosen with surgical precision. I experienced many things during my spacewalk. He paused, his eyes still locked on Dr. Chen. Some I understood. Some I did not. Some I was told not to speak about. Another pause, longer this time. His hands on the table curled slightly, fingers pressing against the polished wood. And some I chose not to speak about. The answer was not an answer. It was an acknowledgement that there were things he could say and things he would not say, boundaries he had drawn for himself or that had been drawn for him. Dr. Chen, still standing, pressed forward. Her voice was respectful but insistent. Why? Why choose silence? The room leaned forward collectively, as though 1,500 people had taken the same breath. Leonov's face changed. A smile appeared, slight and controlled, but it stopped at his mouth. His eyes remained cold, distant, looking at Dr. Chen, but somehow through her. Because some truths are not meant to be told, he said. His voice carried a finality that seemed to close the door on further inquiry. Not yet. Not yet. The two words implied waiting, implied a future revelation, but also reinforced the present silence. The moderator seized the moment, thanking Dr. Chen for her question and quickly calling on another raised hand from the opposite side of the auditorium. The new question was about life support systems, technical and safe, and Leonov answered it with visible relief, his body language relaxing, the charm returning. But Dr. Chen remained standing for another few seconds, staring at Leonov before slowly sitting down. Around her, attendees whispered to each other, exchanging glances. What had they just witnessed? A deflection? A confession? An admission that there were indeed unexplained phenomena sealed away behind decades of official silence? After the panel ended, Leonov descended from the stage and was immediately surrounded by attendees seeking autographs and photographs. He obliged graciously, signing conference programs and posing with his arm around aerospace engineers who wanted proof they had met a legend. But Dr. Chen noticed that he moved purposefully toward the backstage exit, working his way through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew how to be gracious while also escaping. She tried to follow, to catch him in a less public setting and ask her question again. But by the time she reached the backstage corridor, he had disappeared into a green room reserved for speakers. The door was closed. A NASA volunteer stood outside it, politely but firmly preventing access. Inside the green room, Leonov stood near a table laden with bottled water and coffee, talking quietly with Vladimir Shatalov, another Soviet-era cosmonaut who had attended the conference. They spoke in Russian, their voices low, unaware that a sound technician was still in the room, coiling cables near the back wall. The technician, a young man named Marcus Webb, who had studied Russian in college and occasionally worked as a translator, continued his work slowly, listening without appearing to listen. Shatalov was asking about the panel, about Dr. Chen's question. Leonov's response was curt, dismissive. American researchers. They think everything can be quantified, explained. He poured himself water with a hand that shook slightly. Shatalov said something Marcus could not quite hear, and Leonov laughed, but it was a bitter sound, empty of humor. They still do not know, Leonov said, his voice rising just enough to be clearly audible. They still do not understand. Shatalov asked what they did not understand. Leonov set down his water glass with more force than necessary. What is out there? What has always been out there? What we touched and could not name? His voice had an edge to it now, frustration or anger or something else Marcus could not identify. Shatalov said something cautionary, a warning perhaps, and Leonov waved him off. What does it matter now? I am an old man. The Union is gone. The files are sealed forever. No one will ever know the truth. He spoke with the resignation of someone who had carried a burden for so long that its weight had become inseparable from his own body. Shatalov murmured something else, inaudible, and the conversation shifted to safer topics, travel plans, mutual friends, an upcoming reunion of the cosmonaut corps. Marcus finished coiling his cables and left quietly, his mind racing. What is out there? What we touched and could not name? The words felt significant, laden with meaning that Marcus could sense but not quite grasp. He considered approaching Leonov directly, asking for clarification, but he knew how that would end. Denial, deflection, perhaps anger at being overheard in a private moment. Instead, Marcus went home that evening and wrote down everything he remembered, dialogue reconstructed as accurately as he could manage. He kept the notes in a folder on his computer, occasionally rereading them, wondering what Leonov had meant. Years later, after Leonov's death, Marcus would post the story on an internet forum dedicated to space history, where it would be debated, dismissed as fabrication, and eventually forgotten amid thousands of other unverifiable anecdotes. But Dr. Sara Chen did not forget. The question she had asked and Leonov's careful non-answer became the foundation of an obsession that would consume the next decade of her career. She began collecting testimonies, tracking down retired engineers and cosmonauts, building a database of anomalies and irregularities in early space missions. She filed Freedom of Information requests with both American and Russian space agencies. She corresponded with archivists, historians, and journalists who had touched the edges of the same story. Most of her requests were denied. Most of her sources refused to speak on the record. But slowly, piece by piece, she assembled a picture. Incomplete, fragmentary, but undeniable. Something had happened during Leonov's spacewalk. Something that multiple witnesses had seen. Something that had been deliberately hidden, classified, erased from history. In 2009,
Dr. Chen published a paper in an obscure aerospace history journal titled Gaps in the Voskhod 2 Mission Record, an analysis of documentary inconsistencies. It was dry, academic, carefully hedged with qualifications and caveats. But buried in the footnotes and appendices was the evidence she had gathered. The missing 12 minutes, the altered medical files, Viktor Petrov's notebook entry, Pavel Sokolov's testimony, Kazakov's description of the light. The paper generated little attention. It was cited by a handful of researchers and ignored by mainstream space historians. But Dr. Chen had made her point. The official narrative was incomplete. The gaps were real. And Alexei Leonov, who had stood in the Houston auditorium and said some truths were not meant to be told, had known exactly what those gaps concealed.
He carried that knowledge to his grave in 2019, taking with him the answer to Dr. Chen's question, the explanation for the light, the identity of the thing that had waited in the void. The truth remained untold. Not yet, he had said. Perhaps not ever. Irina Volkova was 71 years old when the letter arrived at her apartment in Tallinn. She had lived in Estonia since 2004, after the post-Soviet chaos had finally settled into something resembling stability, and she had decided that Moscow held too many ghosts. Her apartment occupied the third floor of a renovated building in the old town, its windows overlooking cobblestone streets that tourists photographed in summer and wind howled through in winter. She lived alone, her husband dead for 8 years, her daughter married and living in Helsinki. Irina spent her days reading, taking walks along the Baltic shore, and occasionally consulting for archival projects that needed someone who understood Soviet-era classification systems. The past was behind her. Or so she had believed until the envelope arrived on a gray March morning, forwarded from her old Moscow address, bearing no return information but postmarked from the Russian capital. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. No letter, no explanation, just a reference number written in pencil. RG-4-90-8-stroke-opus-4-stroke-Delo-6-7-2-3. Below it, in the same hand, Voskhod 2, External Encounter Documentation. Irina stared at the paper for a long time, her hands beginning to tremble in a way that had nothing to do with age. RGAE was the Russian State Archive of the Economy, where space program materials had been transferred after the Soviet Union's collapse. She recognized the reference format, could decode it automatically after decades of archival work. Fond 98 was the collection designation for early manned spaceflight programs. Opus 4 meant classified materials requiring special authorization. Delo 6723 was the file number, but it was the label that made her breath catch. External Encounter Documentation. Encounter with what? She thought immediately of the 12 minutes, of the gap she had found 35 years earlier, of the copied log sheets she had hidden in her coat pocket before fleeing to Vladivostok. Those sheets had survived her exile, traveled with her through decades and relocations, remained filed in a folder in her desk drawer where she occasionally took them out to remind herself that she had not imagined it. The missing minutes were real. The equipment logs proved communication had continued even when the master tapes were silent. And now, decades later, someone, a former colleague, someone who remembered, someone who knew what she had discovered, had sent her this reference number. A breadcrumb. Proof that the file existed, that it had been catalogued, that somewhere in Moscow's archival labyrinth, the truth was preserved in paper and ink. Irina contacted the RGAE the next day. She submitted a formal research request identifying herself as a retired archivist with clearance history from the Soviet period, requesting access to Delo 6723 for historical research purposes. The response came 3 weeks later. Request denied. No explanation, just a form letter stating that the requested materials were classified and unavailable for public access. Irina submitted a second request, this time invoking Russian Federation Freedom of Information laws that theoretically allowed citizens to access government documents after a certain number of years. Denied again. She hired a lawyer in Moscow, a young woman who specialized in archival access litigation. The lawyer filed an official appeal, arguing that materials from 1965 were well past the standard declassification period and that Irina had legitimate scholarly interest. The Russian Federal Space Agency responded personally this time. The file contained sensitive technical data related to ongoing space program operations and was therefore exempt from disclosure requirements. Ongoing operations. In 2009, related to a mission from 1965, the claim was absurd, transparent in its falseness, but legally sufficient to block access. Irina's lawyer pushed harder, demanding specificity. What technical data? What ongoing operations? The space agency's next response was even more opaque. The file contained information relevant to national security considerations that transcend historical timeline constraints. In other words, none of your business, and we will never tell you why. The lawyer advised Irina that further legal action would be expensive and futile. The Russian government had no intention of opening this file, and courts were unlikely to compel them. Irina thanked her, paid the legal fees, and sat in her Tallinn apartment staring at the reference number, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on her shoulders. She began corresponding with researchers who studied Soviet space history. She contacted Dr. Sara Chen, whose paper on Voskhod 2 inconsistencies had circulated in academic circles. She reached out to journalists who had written about declassified materials. To each, she provided the reference number and explained what little she knew. Most were polite but unhelpful. The file was sealed. Nothing could be done, perhaps in another decade or two. But a few were intrigued. A historian at Cambridge named Dr. Michael Thornton made his own access request and was denied with the same boilerplate language. He began comparing the classification level of Delo 6723 with other sealed Soviet files. What he found was extraordinary. The Voskhod 2 file carried a classification designation that was higher, more restrictive, than files related to nuclear weapons development, higher than files documenting biological weapons research, higher than files concerning KGB infiltration of Western governments. Dr. Thornton published his findings in a brief article for a space policy journal, raising the obvious question. Why would documentation of a 12-minute spacewalk require classification levels exceeding the Soviet Union's most sensitive military secrets. The article generated minor attention in academic circles, but was ignored by mainstream media. The Russian government did not respond. The file remained sealed. Irina read Dr. Thornton's article and felt a grim satisfaction. She had been right. The missing minutes were not a bureaucratic error or a minor technical anomaly. They were important enough to guard with the highest levels of secrecy, important enough to protect even after the state that had classified them had ceased to exist. But satisfaction did not bring answers. The file stayed locked, and Irina was no closer to understanding what external encounter documentation meant. In 2011, Irina received another letter. This one was from a Russian archivist she had worked with briefly in the 1980s, a man named Pyotr who was now retired and living in St. Petersburg. The letter was handwritten, careful, full of oblique phrasing that suggested Pyotr was aware his mail might be monitored. He wrote that he had heard about her interest in certain Voskhod materials and wanted her to know that he had once, very briefly, seen the file catalog entry she was asking about. He had been conducting an inventory of classified holdings in 1997, shortly before retirement, and had come across the reference. He had not been allowed to open the file, but the catalog card had contained a brief description. Visual and telemetric documentation of unidentified object observed during Voskhod 2 EVA. Witness statements, analysis reports, containment protocols. That was all. Pyotr had asked his supervisor about it and been told firmly to note its location and move on. He had never seen it again. Unidentified object. The words confirmed what Irina had suspected, what Kazakov had described, what Pavel Sokolov had seen on film. Something had been out there with Leonov. Something real enough to photograph, to track telemetrically, to prompt witness statements and analysis reports. And containment protocols. What did that mean? Protocols for containing information? Or protocols for containing something else? Irina wrote back to Pyotr, thanking him, asking if he remembered anything else. Her letter was returned unopened. She tried calling the number he had provided. Disconnected. She searched for him online and found an obituary from 6 months earlier. Pyotr had died of a stroke in his St. Petersburg apartment. There was no mention of family, no funeral notice, just a brief acknowledgement that he had passed, followed by bureaucratic silence. Irina spent her final years haunted by proximity to truth she could never quite reach. The reference number sat on her desk, a string of characters that represented answers locked forever behind classification barriers she lacked the power or youth to overcome. She thought often about the technical secretary she had been in 1965, young, precise, trusting that archives were truthful. That woman seemed impossibly distant now, separated not just by time, but by the knowledge of how thoroughly truth could be buried, how effectively silence could be enforced. Irina died in her sleep in February 2012, 3 months before her 74th birthday. Her daughter found her in the morning, still in bed, her face peaceful. Among her possessions was a folder containing the copied log sheets from 1965 and a single piece of paper with a reference number written in pencil. her daughter didn't know what the papers meant. She considered donating them to an archive, but ultimately kept them in a box with other family documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, photographs of people whose names she no longer remembered. The reference number remained on that paper, ink fading slowly over the years, pointing toward a file in Moscow that would never be opened. 6,723 stayed sealed, its contents preserved but inaccessible, a tomb for secrets that outlived the state that created them. The external encounter documentation, whatever it contained, photographs of the luminous shape, Viktor's engineering report, Leonov's original debriefing, analysis of what had maintained parallel trajectory for 11 minutes, remained locked away, patient, silent, waiting for a time that might never come when someone with sufficient authority and courage would finally break the seal and release what had been hidden for more than half a century. Until then, the file sat in darkness, keeping its secrets the way the void keeps secrets, absolutely and without mercy. Today, Leonov's spacewalk is taught as a triumph of human courage. Children learn his name in school, memorize the date, March 18th, 1965, when humanity first stepped freely into the void. Museums display his spacesuit behind protective glass, the white fabric yellowed with age, the visor scratched from its brief exposure to vacuum and radiation. Documentaries recount the mission with stirring music and archival footage carefully edited to show only what is safe to show. The narrative is clean, heroic, unambiguous. Soviet engineering conquered the cosmos. A brave cosmonaut floated above Earth for 12 minutes and 23 seconds, and humanity took another step toward the stars. The story is complete, or so we are told. But in certain circles, among aging engineers who worked at Yevpatoria, retired archivists who remember files that should not have existed, researchers who have spent careers mapping the negative space where documentation should be, a different story persists. They speak carefully, often anonymously, in conference hallways and late-night emails and forum posts that disappear shortly after being written. They mention the missing 12 minutes, the altered medical files, the film canister that vanished. Viktor Petrov's notebook entry describing an anomaly that maintained parallel trajectory. Kazakov's testimony about the light that moved with intention. Pavel Sokolov's description of something luminous and oblong that pulsed with its own internal rhythm. Leonov's cryptic half-confession in Houston, some truths are not meant to be told, not yet. These fragments do not fit the official narrative. They are the pieces that were supposed to stay buried, scattered across decades and continents, separated so thoroughly that assembling them into coherent meaning should be impossible. Yet here they are. A pattern emerges when you lay them side by side, like shards of a mirror that reflect the same hidden truth from different angles. Something happened during Leonov's spacewalk. Something beyond equipment malfunction or psychological stress or the normal challenges of spaceflight. Something that required immediate intervention from Korolyov himself, that prompted the creation of Protocol 17, that necessitated the highest levels of classification, higher than nuclear secrets, higher than biological weapons, higher than the most sensitive intelligence operations. Something that multiple trained observers witnessed independently, but were forbidden to discuss. Something that was photographed, tracked, documented, and then locked away so completely that even its existence became deniable. The question is not whether something happened. The evidence makes that clear. The question is what, and why the answer remains so dangerous that it must be protected even now, 60 years later, long after the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended and most of the witnesses died. Dr. Sara Chen, who spent 15 years collecting fragments of this story, proposed a theory in her final paper before retiring from JPL. She suggested that Leonov encountered something during those 12 minutes that challenged fundamental assumptions about humanity's place in the cosmos. Not a technical anomaly, not a hallucination. Something real, something external, something that implied we are not alone and perhaps never have been. The Soviet leadership, faced with evidence that contradicted materialist philosophy and threatened social stability, made a choice: classify everything, rewrite the record, and force silence. Better to bury the truth than risk the questions it would raise. Better to maintain the narrative of human mastery over space than acknowledge that space might contain things beyond human understanding. Chen's theory was dismissed by mainstream historians as speculation unsupported by direct evidence, but she noted in her conclusion that the most compelling proof of her theory was the continued classification itself. If the file contained nothing significant, why not release it? Why maintain secrecy that costs resources and invites suspicion? The silence, she argued, is the loudest confession. In 2019, Alexei Leonov died in Moscow at the age of 85. Tributes poured in from around the world. The Russian government declared a day of mourning.
Astronauts and cosmonauts gathered to honor the first human to walk in space,
To celebrate a life devoted to exploration and courage. At the funeral, colleagues told familiar stories: Leonov's skill as a pilot, his talent as an artist, his warmth as a friend. No one mentioned the 12 minutes. No one spoke of the light or the silence that had texture, or the thing Leonov had whispered to Georgy Grechko decades earlier: I was not alone out there. Those stories remained unspoken, relegated to the margins, the territory of conspiracy theorists and fringe researchers who lacked proper credentials and institutional backing. But among the mourners was a small group who knew: former engineers, retired archivists, a few journalists who had touched the edges of the story and been warned away. They stood together near the back of the ceremony and said nothing, bound by a shared awareness that the truth was being buried again, this time with the only man who could have confirmed it. After Leonov's death, there was speculation that his personal papers might contain revelations, that perhaps he had written something in his final years, freed by age and proximity to death from the constraints that had bound him. His family donated materials to the State Archive: letters, photographs, artwork, training documents. Researchers requested access. They found nothing unexpected. No confession, no detailed account of what happened during the spacewalk. Either Leonov had never committed it to paper, or those papers had been removed before the donation was made. The silence held. But something strange happened in the months following his death. Multiple sources, archivists, government clerks, researchers with connections inside the Russian space bureaucracy reported that Delo 6723, the sealed file containing external encounter documentation, had been moved, not destroyed, not declassified. Moved to a different facility with even more restrictive access protocols. As though Leonov's death had prompted a review, a decision that the material was still too sensitive, still too dangerous, and needed additional protection. The file exists, that much is certain. It sits somewhere in Moscow or its outskirts in a vault designed to survive fire and flood and political upheaval, cataloged under a reference number that researchers know but cannot access. Inside, if the catalog description is accurate, are photographs, telemetry data, witness statements, analysis reports, containment protocols. Everything needed to understand what Leonov saw, what moved with intention across Pavel Sokolov's screen, what Kazakov and 3 other technicians watched until Korolyov ordered the monitors shut down. The shape that was luminous and oblong, that pulsed with internal light, that maintained parallel trajectory for 11 minutes. The thing that prompted Viktor Petrov to write in his hidden notebook, "Something was waiting for us out there. Something has always been waiting." All of it preserved, protected, kept from the world by classification barriers that show no sign of falling. Why? That question haunts everyone who has investigated this story. Why does it still matter? The Soviet Union is gone. The Cold War is over. The cosmonauts are dead. What possible reason could justify maintaining this level of secrecy about events from 60 years ago? Some researchers suggest institutional inertia. The file was classified, therefore it remains classified, because bureaucracies resist change and challenging old decisions requires effort no one is willing to expend. Others propose that the material is genuinely sensitive, that it contains information about surveillance capabilities or weapons systems that remain relevant. But these explanations feel insufficient when confronted with the classification level, with the continued denials, with the pattern of witnesses being silenced and evidence being erased. The simpler explanation, the one that fits the evidence best, is that the file contains something the Russian government, and perhaps governments generally, do not want their citizens to know. Something that would raise questions about what else has been hidden. Something that would change how we understand our relationship to space, to the unknown, to the possibility that we are not the only intelligence observing the cosmos. The story ends as it began, with silence. Leonov is dead. The witnesses are dead. The files remain sealed. The 12 minutes stay missing from the official record. Researchers continue to request access and continue to be denied. The truth, whatever it is, sits locked away in Moscow, patient and waiting, protected by classification barriers that may never fall. But the fragments persist. The testimonies survive in letters and interviews and notebooks. The gaps in the official narrative remain visible to anyone who looks closely enough. And sometimes, rarely, new pieces surface. A former technician on his deathbed mentions seeing something on the monitors. A journalist receives an anonymous envelope containing photocopied documents. An archivist quietly confirms that yes, there is a file and No, you cannot see it. The story refuses to die completely. It lives in the spaces between official history, in the things that were supposed to be forgotten but were not, in the questions that remain unanswered because the answers are too dangerous to speak. Perhaps one day the file will open. Perhaps political change or bureaucratic accident or simple passage of time will finally break the seal. Perhaps we will see the photographs, read the witness statements, understand what Leonov encountered during those 12 minutes. Or perhaps the file will remain closed forever, the truth locked away until it decays beyond recovery, until even the people who know it exists are gone, and the reference number points to nothing but dust and forgotten protocol. Either way, the story serves as a reminder that official history is always incomplete, that silence can be as revealing as speech, and that some questions about what waits in the void, about what we touched and could not name, may never receive answers. The light that moved with intention, that pulsed with internal rhythm, that Viktor Petrov said was waiting for us, remains unnamed. And we are left to wonder, if something was waiting then, is it waiting still? In the darkness beyond our spacecraft, in the gaps in our knowledge, in the classified files we cannot open, is it out there even now, patient and observing, keeping its own silence while we keep ours? If this story has made you wonder what else might be hidden in the archives of the Soviet space program, I encourage you to watch the other videos on this channel where we explore more mysteries that official history prefers to forget. Write your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Leonov encountered something during those 12 minutes? Or is this simply the product of Cold War paranoia and missing documentation? And if this story resonated with you, if it made you question what we have been told about humanity's first steps into space, please like this video. The truth may be locked away in Moscow, but the questions deserve to be remembered.